of the world because we're on a consumption tax base. We, in effect, have a zero effective corporate tax rate, which will be a tremendous incentive to move, not to just to keep profits from going to Ireland, but to move those profits back. And more important than that, not just to move jobs to Singapore, but to move those jobs back. So I really think this is an incredibly good tax plan. And should we as economists be be a little bit stronger in our endorsement of this proposal than I think? It's not really, if there's a regular reporter in this room, are they really getting that message, or am I overly enthusiastic? And I understand all the caveats about WTO and wealth, but should we be communicating this better to Congress, the benefits of border tax adjustments? Thank you.
Well, I don't disagree with that.
So the answer is, if you can count on them, yes. But if they're illusory, no. I mean, because, and you'd like to dismiss it, but we can't dismiss it. Now, we could do this and not count on the revenue from taxing imports, and maybe phase in as the growth and investment tax did. They had essentially a subtraction method VAT with a deduction for wages, and they didn't count the revenue from taxing imports, presumably because they were concerned about WTO compliance. And you could phase it in so U.S. companies wouldn't be facing many countervailing duties. But I think any trade lawyer who looks at this for very long says it's not compliant. And that's, well, we can wring our hands about it. Those are the facts. But I happen to agree with your basic thrust, Mr. Chairman, that we should be talking about the benefits of something like this. Now, I'm surprised one of you economists hasn't said, oh, well, it's all going to wash out in the exchange rates anyway, so it doesn't matter. But
well, no. In fact, what washes out in the exchange rates is the export or the trade. So that's why it should be WTO compliant, even if it isn't. But so what washes out should be the WTO objection. But what's left is the fact that there's no source-based tax.
Right, and then at that point, other countries would try to catch up with our leapfrogging, but we'd be ahead.
Mindy?
Yeah. So everyone's so positive. So aside from the WTO, I'm trying to understand who are the losers in this. It's win-win-win maybe in the U.S., but is it Ireland and Singapore who are the losers, or are there some businesses in the U.S. who are losers?
Well, yes, Ireland and Singapore. We set up a tax system that doesn't work, and other countries take advantage of us, and they wouldn't be able to take advantage of us. And I guess that really shouldn't be a break to our adopting a better tax policy. We certainly would lose. I mentioned, to the extent that we're successful in taxing U.S. source income, we'd be giving that up. And if we were a resource, if we were a developing country heavily dependent on natural resources, this would not be the main tax we'd want to adopt. Even a country like Australia, which relies more heavily on natural resources as a share of corporate revenue, would want, as they propose, to have some additional tax if they were going to go this way with a corporate tax. So there's certainly going to be some industries and asset owners who benefit and have a lower tax burden as a result. And I think that would be, a major concern as a point relating to the point that Alan raised earlier. Some of it could be dealt with transition rules. Some of it perhaps not.
I haven't thought this through completely, but the initial reaction to Brady are companies that rely a lot on imports, or think Walmart, who sells a lot from China, isn't necessarily going to be very happy with the 20% tax being imposed on everything they import.
They wouldn't be happy with a very high retail sales tax either.
Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, they're,
Yeah.
Okay, so unless there's another question, I think we can wrap up, and I hope you can join me to thank.
we have drafts. We'll have an auction afterward for the few copies that we have.
You're not his professor.
Okay, so thank you very much to our panelists, and yeah.
Very well done. You really moved the ball. Yeah.
Which is actually a great thing. It kind of plays to my worst instincts, which is to write discussant comments while attending the conference rather than in advance. First of all, I really want to applaud Alan, Michael, all of the other participants in this program. I think it's a great project. I think it's very, very important. As Mark Mazur mentioned, the corporate tax is a significant source of revenue. The United States is $400 billion per year, and it's under siege. It's timely, at least in the US, as Mark and Michael pointed out. There's a lot of interest in tax reform here. Barack Obama has a framework, which I think probably inside the Treasury Department is even a proposal. The Brady, Hatch, Camp, all of the GOP candidates, except for Donald Trump, have basically proposed major reforms to business taxation, and actually all in the nature of replacing an income tax with a consumption tax. And it's possible that any day now Donald Trump will have a proposal that looks like that too. It's possible anything else could happen there as well. But people who say they work for Trump say that there's something that looks more like Alan's proposal that might be in the future. There's a cautionary tale, and you can see that by looking at the calendar. Today is 14 Juillet, the 14th of July, or Bastille Day. And the immediate cause of the stirring of the Bastille was the fact that Louis XVI got cold feet about the whole idea of democracy and a constitution, but class divisions were clearly a big issue. I would argue that income inequality in the United States is probably a bigger political issue now than it was in the United States in 1789. So the reality and the optics of these reform proposals create challenges. So that would affect the goals of the change. I think Alan appropriately focused on progressivity. The question I asked earlier about taxing rents, I think one of the big issues in income inequality in the United States is that so much income at the top is basically coming from pure rent seeking, and a lot of it is economically inefficient. So at best, or at worst, taxing rents would have no effect, because if they're pure monopoly profits, you still have an incentive to earn them, even if you only get 50 or 70% of them. And some of those things actually have very little economic value, and even shutting them down would not be a bad thing. The other thing that's fueling discord in the US is a sense that our tax system is a black box. So this conference focused on, and this project is focused on some of the fundamental choices facing reformers. One is, do we take an incremental approach, or do we do fundamental reform? Do we try to preserve the income tax in some form, or do we move towards a consumption tax? If we keep the income tax, do we do it on a territorial basis or a worldwide basis? Some of the insights that were raised today, one is that avoidance of the corporate tax entails costs, and that real avoidance, moving labor from one place to another to avoid the tax, is much more costly than the paper avoidance that might have motivated some of the reform proposals like BEPS. And that's also politically challenging as well. I think there was overwhelming support for the whole BEPS project from this group. Oh, no, actually not. That the BEPS project focused on paper avoidance, and it's probably, if it were implemented, it would stimulate even more real avoidance behavior. And then it ignores the fundamental flaws in corporate income taxes around the world. Mike proposed an incremental option that was intended to deter real avoidance, preserve the fundamental nature of the tax system, but fix the most serious distortions. The biggest challenge is that I think the proposal is very complex, that figuring out those look-through rules that would keep people from avoiding taxes, as Mike acknowledged, would be a really big challenge. You still need to measure worldwide profits to figure out the residual income to be subject to tax. And the imputation of a normal return could be hard to explain to real people who are not tax economists. Alan's proposal is a lot simpler. He says his proposal is highly progressive, but of course progressivity would be measured relative to our current income tax and not just in a vacuum. And the current corporate income tax in the United States is probably the second most progressive tax in the U.S. after the estate tax. It would be efficient, and one of the nice features of moving towards a consumption tax base is, one, it would tax economic rents, at least earned by domestic entities on consumption in the U.S. And the other thing is that you could actually raise business tax rates without affecting the cost of capital, which would just be zero. I think one of the issues that came up in the presidential campaign is Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, for that matter, proposed consumption taxes, but at levels that would have produced, at least by our scoring, huge deficits over the next, well, forever. Marco Rubio's plan, the effective tax rate was actually slightly negative because he exempted the normal return on capital, plus he would preserve research tax credits. So he could have doubled his business tax rate, or his ex-tax rate, and probably raised enough revenue to finance the government. Again, it would have scored really well by ordinary efficiency metrics. The other thing, and I think John was alluding to this, is that this kind of reform could finance progressive changes to, John mentioned payroll taxes. You could also increase refundable credits under the income tax or do other things that could buy in more bipartisan support and deal with concerns about income inequality, stopping the masses from storming the Bastille. The biggest issue, I think, in the consumption tax proposal is the fact that refundability is necessary and the optics could be really, really terrible. You could have companies that have very, very large profits and that were claiming big net tax refunds, or even if they were offsetting their corporate tax against the payroll tax, somebody would point out that they were effectively paying a negative tax relative to their income. And not allowing for refundability also creates issues, as John pointed out. It create very strong incentives for mergers between companies that have tax liability and ones that didn't, and especially if you're accumulating losses with interest. The other kinds of options that might be worth discussing in the book are the integration proposals that, say, Alan Viard and Eric Toder have proposed, and others. And another thing that might be worth looking at is the Donald Trump proposal in Trump 1, where he doubled down on worldwide taxation, but at very, very low rates. So what about the idea of trying to tax worldwide taxation on an accrual basis at a 10% rate? And I think he could probably address that, and it probably has a lot to do with how other countries would respond, but at least in a vacuum, it might be a way to raise a significant amount of revenue with relatively small distortionary costs because the tax rate would be so low. But the basic message, and everybody wants to leave, and I'm going to stop, but is fixing the corporate tax is certainly timely. If there's any chance for reform in the U.S., it's on the business tax side, and the work that you're doing is enormously valuable. So thank you very much for it.